let me step back. So a lot of questions this week in the Discord had to do with relating data to each other. It's like relate one collection to another collection, and then using those relationships inside of your app. And so what I think would be really good for showing that is just to build it from scratch, a really simple system. What I'm going to build is a customer list and a list of invoices. And then what we're going to do is show how you can select a customer on an invoice and then go look at the customer and see a list of that customer's invoices and do things like search for a customer name on the invoices list, that kind of thing. So we're basically going to have data. We're going to have record edit forms. Now, I'm not going to build the invoices out with like line items and calculations and all that, because that's not really the purpose of today's call. But it'll basically give you the general idea of how you relate data to each other. And then if we have time, I'd also like to show how you can do something like create a URL route that matches that matches up to that invoice record, so that you could share a link directly to that invoice for the customer. Something along those lines, and make it to where it's not something that someone could just go to a URL route and just find that invoice. Like they would have to find that. They'd have to know the specific information about that invoice in order to get to it. So you have like a unique link that only you would share with that customer. So that's what I'm going to go through. So we'll start with building a customer list. I'm also going to probably add most of the data from the data collections area, instead of like building out all the actions for creating records and all those things, and like building create record pages and stuff like that. We'll keep it as simple as possible to focus on the data relationships. So I think that's it. So I'll just go ahead and dive in. First thing I'm going to do is just add a blank page, and this will be our well, actually, let's do it as like a home page. And I'm going to add a couple of containers here. We'll add a div for an outer, and we're going to add, yeah, that's fine. We'll just do it this way. I'm just going to do two lists, list of customers and list of invoices. So let's go, we'll do a grid, and we'll drop that inside of this. I'm going to change this outer to say customers. And we're also going to change the grid list. I'll specify that this is for customers. And then we're going to add another page called, let's do a block with a row called grid row outer. We'll name that customer row. And this is going to be customer name. I'm going to delete this image because we're not going to do an image for the customer right now. And then this button, I think I'll delete that because we're going to just use we're just going to click on it to open it instead of having a button. So we're literally just going to have a list of customers by name. It'll be pretty simple. So back over here, I'll go associate the customer row to that page. So now we can see we've got a list of these showing up. Let's add a heading above. We'll call it customers. And then we're going to add another heading below it. Actually, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to come over here and just duplicate this. So we have another one. And then change this to invoices. And then over here, change this to invoices. And then I'm going to duplicate this page. And we'll call it invoice row. Okay, so now I'm just basically going through. So we're going to have customer name here as well. And then maybe we'll have something like, well, I guess I'll just put a text box to say this is a invoice. So let's put that like here. And, you know, obviously we would want to style this a little different if we were actually going to make this a full-on system. But I'll go invoice row. Okay, so now I've got customers and I have invoices, right? Let me put a little margin on this. It shows up a little cleaner. Just do margin 10 pixels. Oh, put that on the grid row. I put it in the wrong spot. One sec. So we want that here. Margin, 10 pixels. Okay, so now we got a little space there. So it's like, this is my invoices and these are my customers. All right, and then the last thing I'm going to do is on this page for the moment is do an input. I'll just use a text, or I guess I'll use a search. So I'm going to put a search like at the very top. And this search, did I miss it? No, there we go. Let me put it here above. Okay, so this search, what I'm going to do later is we'll make an action that searches the customers and searches the invoices. Okay, so it searches both. So you just like filter for both of them. So now what I'm going to do is go set up my data. And sometimes you might set up the data first. Other times you might go and like start binding it, and you can set the data up from the bindings. It just totally depends on how you want to do it. I'll just do it by going and setting up the collections. So I'll make a customers collection. We're going to keep it really simple. We're just going to have like customer name. And then over on our invoices, we're going to have, maybe we'll do like invoice date, something like that. Say that's a date. And then we'll also do customer ID. Okay, so this is where we're going to start relating things. Okay, so when we create an invoice record, we're going to need to know which customer we're associating to that invoice, or we're going to put a way on the invoice form to select the customer for that invoice. So depending on the user experience you want for your end user to use this, they may go to a customer record and click add invoice from there, and we'll push the customer ID into that field whenever they create the record for the invoice, or they'll click a create invoice button generally, and then on that form, they would select from a list of customers, and you would fill in the customer ID. You'd update the invoice record to have the customer ID that they select. So we can go through both of those methods, or I'll just pick one to start, and then we can see where it goes. Okay, so now I've got some different data. Now we need to go bind that data into these different elements that we put onto the different pages. So we'll start with the grids over here. So on the customers grid, I'll go to the data tab, go to the collection list. We're going to select the customers table or collection. In this case, I want to get all the fields for the whole thing. And I'm not going to filter this at all. It's just going to give me everything. And then we'll add a sort here. Let's sort it by the customer name, and we'll keep it ascending. So basically now, whatever customers we have in our system, they're going to show up there. There's no filters, so it doesn't matter if anything about it. It's just going to all show up. We'll do the exact same thing for the invoices list, except for we'll do invoices instead, get all fields. And in this case, I think maybe let's sort it by the created date time, descending. So the most recent one will just stay at the top. And then it's ordered by, just by that. You could also do like order by customer name and then descending of the created date time. So you'd have it like organized by the customers and then per customer each one. So there's a lot of ways to get creative with how you want to show this off or show your invoices to the people that are using your system. On each of these rows, we now need to bind this information here as well. So what I'll do is in the customer name, I'll go data, record value from field. We're saying it's coming from the customers and it's coming from the customer name. And then this binding is going to get a little bit different because remember, we don't actually have the name of the customer in the record information for the invoice. In the invoice, all we're going to store is the customer ID. And the reason for that is if you stored the customer name on the invoice record itself, then you would basically, if somebody went and updated the customer name on the customer record, you would have to also go push that data out to every invoice record and update the customer name on every invoice record. So we don't want to do that. We only want to store the ID of the customer on the invoice instead. And that'll make it to where on the pages where we're displaying the invoice, we need to reference the customer ID and set that data into the customer name wherever we're displaying it. So we're not going to go in here and do like, record value or any of that stuff, because this is assuming a context of that data lives inside of this record, which it does not, because there is no customer name inside of an invoice. So I hope that makes sense. If not, ask questions and I can dive in deeper. Before we go into that, we need to now like create some records so that we have some data to display. So there's a couple different things we can do there. First, let's do, I think I'll just do some customers from the data collections area rather than creating the, things out of it. Let's go, I'll just add like 4 records or 5 records here. So I'll just do like Mark, Cora, Drew, I see Tom in here. I see Emmanuel in here. All right, so we'll just go like that. Okay, so now we have these 5 records. So before we go any further, let's now preview this and we can just look at this home page in preview. So we go preview. First time I've done it, so I need to tell it what the home page is. And we'll go open this up. So we should see our customers list here. So now we have Cora, Drew, Emmanuel, Mark, Tom, right? So sorted by the name, and we have the different rows here. So now let's do a few other things to play around with this data. So let's go ahead and put the search in place so that we can type in a search and see the results. So what I'm going to do is on the event inside of here, I want to do it as the user's typing, right? So like when the user types in a letter, I want it to filter that data and show me only the results as it goes. So what you want to use for that are these different key events. So what these literally mean, like key up, is actually when the key comes up. So like after it's up, so you press it, right? And so that's key press. Key down is like when it gets down. Key up is when it gets up. And so these are very specific and you can use them for different purposes. I usually, for this type of thing, I'll use key up. And there is one caveat here. This was also in a Discord question earlier this week, so we can go over it. Search fields in particular are sort of like, they have some special attributes to them. Like in certain browsers, you're going to see a little X there where you can click the X and clear it out. And the thing is, when you click that X, there's no key up happening, right? And so there's like, you didn't have a key on the keyboard come up, so it's not going to run our flow to do the search. So we'll have a different event just for that one thing of like clicking that X, which we'll set up in just a second. And not all browsers are even going to render that X, so it won't even show up everywhere, but you need to cover it as an edge case. So let's make a new flow. I'll call it just run search. And the action we're going to add, if I just type in search in here, there's this one called grid, search grid value. That's what we're going to use. You select the grid that you're going to search. So in this case, we're going to search the customers. And the value we're going to search with is from an element, which is that search input. So what we're saying is we're going to go search the customers list using the value inside of here. This search key for this, you can just leave it alone. If you don't include a search key, what that means is that it's going to search everything inside of the rows of that grid. So it'll find it no matter where the data is. So it'll search basically all the fields that you've got mapped to everything that's in there. If you want to get really specific with it, like I could say, only search the customer name, right? So if I do that, it's going to limit that search. I can also change this to a different key type, and I can just type in the types of data that I want it to search. So like if you're getting data, say from Xano, and you put it into the grid search doesn't have the context to like select the field from a builder collection. You need to provide the field names from Xano that you want to search because they're going to live inside that grid as well. But for the most part, you can just leave this. Like most of the time, it's just fine to leave that completely empty. So let me go back to the preview real quick. So now I can come in here, and if I just type Cora, it's just going to do that in real time. So if I do an R, it'll find those different things. So Emmanuel, right? So as the user is typing. So if we look at this X, remember what I was saying, if I hit that, see, it doesn't do the search. It doesn't reset the search. If I hit a space or something in there, it'll reset it because now the key comes up and down. So the last thing we want to do on that event of this element, so let me close this. We want to add a new event here called search. So this is something that's basically specific. It's only for inputs of type search. And I did actually write a task to go make this a default event for this type of element, because it really should be defaulted for search elements. So basically what we want to do is say, run the search whenever they click that. And then the video is hiding my stuff here. So now if I come here and I hit the X, it's going to undo it, right? So now we've got some data in there. We are able to search that data. We're displaying the data. Now we need to do a couple other things. We need to create a new invoice for a customer. And then we need to relate that invoice with that customer ID. So the first way I'm going to do that is with a button on a customer record. So we'll create a button, which I deleted the one that was on there before, but that's okay. So we'll just create that button, and let me move where it is. So it's out there. All right, and we're just going to say create invoice. All right, so now on button click, I'm going to go create a new record. So I need to make a flow for create invoice. And inside that flow, we're going to add one action, the create record action. We need to choose which collection we're creating the record into, which is invoices. And we need to map any fields that we want. So for this, what we want is the customer ID. And we can put an invoice date if we want. So maybe we'll do like today's date or something like that. We could do from there. Actually, usually you'd probably select that as a, like a field on the page. So we'll add that to this row so we can select it. Or actually, we'll create a little edit page. So when we open it, we can do it in there. So let's leave that off. So what I want to do, though, is get the customer ID from the customer that I'm on when I click this and default that customer ID into the invoice to do that relationship. So let's go with, instead of from a value in the element, we're going to go from variable. So let me just kind of describe why we're going to go from variable. So if you remember, when the data binding runs, if we go look over here in the data on the grid, we're getting all the fields of the customer. One of the fields is ID. So what this means is when the data gets set into the grid, each record becomes a row in the grid. So over here, we have these 5 rows because there's 5 records of data. Inside of each row, each field of data for that record becomes a variable inside of the row that you can reference for anything you want. So inside of each row, there's a variable called ID that is that customer's ID. And inside of there, there's another variable called created date. And there's another one with a field ID for customer name that has the actual customer name in it. So we keep all that in variables inside of those rows so that you can reference them for different purposes. But the main thing we're going to do here, the only thing we're actually going to do here is reference the customer ID, which is probably the most common reference of that type. And all you have to do is literally just type ID. So we're basically saying, I'm in this row of a customer. I'm in the context of this record. I click create invoice for this record, for this customer. So this is where the relationship comes in. We're going to take the current customer ID and pass it to our new invoice record in the invoices customer ID field. So now we have an invoice record with a customer ID associated to it that we can then use for like filtering and finding it later on, which we'll do in just a minute. All right, so now we need to do one more thing. We basically need to refresh this list when a new invoice is created. So right now, if I come up here and I just click create invoice, it went and created it, but we're not telling it to redisplay it. So if I refresh this, if I refresh the page, the binding will run and we see we have one invoice here now. All right, so if I do it again for a different one for Drew and refresh again, now we have 2 of them. All right, so there's some things now we need to do to make this automatic. First, we're going to refresh this list whenever we do the create invoice. And then the other thing we're going to do is tie this customer name, set the binding up to make it to where when this loads, it'll set the customer name into there using that customer ID to find the proper customer. So let's do the refreshing first. There are 2 ways to do this refresh. I could put an action here after the create record that runs a flow back on the home page to do the refresh. So I could do run flow on page. I would want to make sure I have a wait here. And I want to choose my home page because I want to run a flow back here. And in this case, the flow I would run is page binding because that's the only thing I have over there that's actually going to refresh that. The only problem with doing it this way is when you run the page binding, it's actually going to run the page binding for everything. So it's going to go get go check to see if there's any new customers, go check to see if there's any new invoices and rerun it all. In our case, that's actually fine because it's going to use the local cache anyways. So it's not going to actually have to take any time to do that. So it's not really a big deal. But now if I come here, you can see it's going to add those in real time, right? So now it's pushing that back. The other way to do it, I could remove this and instead over here on the home page in my flows, what I want to do is basically tell the system to run this page binding anytime there's a new invoice added or deleted. And to do that, you go to the page settings because we're basically going to set up a listener on this page that says listen for invoice record modifications. And when a certain type of modification happens to invoice records, do a certain thing on this page, so on the home page. To do that, there's what you want to do is go to the page properties. There's two methods to get there. One is through the page body, and the other is through page properties. So it goes to the same place. If you click on that, it's going to open this up. And on the right here, we have data listeners. So this is where we're setting up a listener for that specific thing we're going to try to do. So I'm going to add a new data listener. And the flow I want to run is page binding. The collection I want to listen to is invoices. And I want it to only run on add remove. So what this is saying is when an invoice is added or removed, run the page binding on this home page. So we create that listener, and I believe that should just work. Might have to refresh to get the listener. Let's see, because the listener wasn't set up. So we do that, and now it runs. So those are the two methods to do this, like update that thing on the other page. So one is after the create invoice action inside that same flow, run a flow on the other page. The other method is set up a data listener that automates that. The difference between those two, a data listener is going to happen across sessions. So if I have this open in multiple tabs, or like you're open, you have the same list of records that I have because we're signed in as the same user or it's public data. When I create that invoice, your browser over in your computer is going to get that new invoice automatically pushed out to it as well with a listener. With the run flow on page, it's not going to do that across sessions. It's only inside of this one browser tab I have open. So depending on the purpose, you'll do it in different ways. I'll leave it like this for the purposes of what we're doing here. Okay, so now we have a couple of different data collections. We're now creating records from one of those collections, in this case, customer. We're creating a new invoice record and automatically relating the customer ID to the new invoice records, depending on which customer I've clicked the button on. It's going to push that customer's ID into the new invoice record, which now will allow us to set this customer name using that ID on this invoice. Okay, so to do that, instead of a normal binding like we did here where we set up data binding, what we're going to do instead is use a flow. So we're going to use an action to actually run this. So by default on every page, you have page load and you have page binding nested inside of that, which is this flow here. And the page binding runs any elements that you've set the data tab on. This is the action that actually says, okay, go get all the data for all that and set it all in the right place. But in this case, we're not going to use page binding for the purposes of setting the customer name. What we're going to do instead is do a set element value, which is this one. And the element we're going to set is the customer name. And the value is going to come from the customer collection. And the ID that we want is from the current record field value, invoices, customer ID. Okay, so let me just walk you through what that means. So right now I'm on this invoice row page, which means I'm in the context of a specific invoice record. And what I'm telling Builder to do here is to set the value of that customer name. And the customer that I need is the one where the current invoice, the current record field value of the customer ID is the ID of the customer, right? So I'm basically saying that customer ID comes from this current row invoice customer ID field value, whatever's in there. And because I pushed that from the other record or from the create, it's going to be there for us. Now there's two other things we need to do here. One is we're telling it what field we want. If I choose get all fields here, it's going to go find that customer record, but it's going to set all the fields into the customer name. And we don't want that. We want just the customer name in there. So we're going to do just the customer name. And then the last piece is right here. So this data format down here at the bottom, by default, it's a JSON array. When you go get a collection of data, it's going to be an array of data that's brought back to you. So if there's like 2 or 3 records, you're going to have, object 1, object 2, object 3 inside this JSON array. In this case, we don't want it as a JSON array. We want a specific value out of it. We're just looking for this customer name. So we're going to change this to comma separated. So by doing this, we're basically setting up our own custom binding effectively. We're telling it, go get it from this other table, go get this specific record, go get this specific value from that record, and only provide that value inside the customer name. And that should be all we need to do. So if I refresh this, it'll run everything, and you can now see what it's related to. If I add a new one, so we add Tom in here, it adds invoice Tom. And notice it's doing it in order, right? Remember we said do it in the order of creation. So it's setting those in the order of creation here. And now that I have some data on here, I'm going to go add to my search. We go back to the same event. We go run search. And in here, I'm going to add another search grid. So I'm just going to duplicate this one and change from grid list customers to grid list invoices. So now that same typing will search both grids. So we'll go back to home. And if I type Tom, well, maybe. Yeah, we got a bug. Let's see. I wonder why it's not finding it. It should be finding it. Any thoughts, Drew? Why would that not be finding it? That should work, huh?
I don't know. It's a variable in there, right, with that name, right? Oh, it doesn't matter the name. Yeah.
Oh, it's not. No, that's exactly why. It's not. There is no variable in there with that name in there. You're absolutely right. Because of the way that I did the binding. Thank you, Drew, for calling that out. So because of the way I did the binding, the customer name, remember the customer name doesn't actually exist inside of that record. Inside of the invoice record, there is no customer name. So basically what we're doing is we're telling it, go search that and look for Emmanuel or whatever. But really the only thing that exists inside that record is the ID of the customer, not the name. So if I want this to work right, what I can do is in the page binding, we're going to do a set variable to add to the list of things that it will search. So I can basically set, I'll just do customer. And actually, I'll do this. This will be interesting. I could do this in a bunch of different ways to set that variable. What I'm going to do, though, is pull it out of that field. So this will go set the field with the customer name. And then I'm going to set this variable called customer using the customer name value that's in the field that I just set. So now I will have to refresh because it's got to redraw that. So now if I type Tom, it'll just come up. So that search is searching the variables inside of those rows. And because in the invoices, we didn't set the customer name as a variable because it's not part of the data, it basically doesn't have that. So we can just create it manually anytime we want. So this is going to run on every row, so it'll automatically be searching every single row. Okay, so before I go any further, because the next thing I'm going to do is like an edit page and stuff, Drew or Cora, are there questions that we should go through on these things beforehand?
There's nothing. Yeah, there's nothing from the chat.
Okay.
So
cool.
You must be doing a really good job.
Or I'm confusing everyone. One of the two.
No. Sometimes this stuff takes time to digest, so the recording will be perfect for that.
Yeah, and I can also make a pattern for this. Like I can just take this thing and make a pattern out of it. So you have like the pre-built thing and you can come in and check it out.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Cool.
So let's see. So let's make an edit page for the invoice row. And that edit page will put the invoice date on it so that we can like select the date instead of just create, not having the date or defaulting the date. We'll have a date field on it. So I'm going to make a new page here. We'll just do a blank page. And I'll call this invoice detail. And we're going to make this like really simple. Normally, if I was making an invoice page, I would make it like look like an invoice record for the system or something. But in this case, we're just going to go like super simple. So I'll put a heading on here and we'll just do invoice. And then we're going to put an input, a date input here. So let's go date input. And I guess we should probably put a text box on there too, to specify that this is the invoice date. Right, so this is invoice date, and I'm going to go ahead and name this date input, or maybe just invoice date. I always rename these fields, so if I have multiple, I can know which date is which. And then we'll do another text box. And y'all feel free to stop me too, like Drew, if I need to stop and answer a question, let me know. Let's do customer name here. I'm sorry, customer is actually what it is. And we can make this, I'll actually just display it in here just to keep it simple. We'll do the exact same thing we did over here. We'll just set it in there. We'll just make this the one that we're going to modify on this in this point. So in here, the invoice date, because it's coming from the context of the invoice, we have that information there on the invoice. We're going to pull it from the invoice itself and get the invoice date in there, which by default, all these are going to be empty because we aren't setting it when we create the invoice. On the customer, I'm going to use the exact same thing I did over here because I'll have the context of that information the same way. So I'm going to go to the page binding over here and just copy that set element value. Actually, I'll change this to set value name, just to have a nicer name on it. Set variable customer. And then I'll copy this and go into my invoice detail page and paste that same thing. Okay, so now it's going to use the exact same information. I'm going to have current record, invoice, customer ID, all that stuff is going to exist in here by default. And that's going to be the next part that I want to explain of how Builder automatically passes this data. If I click on this row and we do an open page action, we're going to open the invoice detail. That's going to automatically push the context of which invoice we're opening into this invoice detail page. So that way all the data binding stuff will just work on its own. Right? You can also do all that manually, and we do sometimes in like more complex systems. You're opening pages that actually have like record detail from 3 or 4 places or whatever. And in that scenario, you may not actually do bindings and stuff. You might use actions for everything and you're doing filtering and it can get really complex. That's why it's not an automatic thing everywhere, is because as you build out more complex systems, the more restrictive we are in those data bindings, the less you can actually do. So without like crazy workarounds and stuff. So the general concept here that we're going to do now is when we click on the invoice row, we're going to open the invoice detail. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to open it into a Lightbox. Normally I might do something like slide in a nice panel and format it real cleanly, but we're just going to open it into a Lightbox. There's not much data. And then we'll talk through how that all relates here. And we'll set it up to where you can modify this invoice date and it'll go update that data back on the invoice record. So what I'm going to do is when you click on this invoice row, I want to open a Lightbox and I want to open this invoice page into that Lightbox. So typically the way that I'll do this, there's one of 2 methods for the Lightbox. One method is you go on the home page and you add a Lightbox element. So I'll just use the Lightbox centered element here, and I'm just going to drop it on this page. Now by default, the Lightbox is hidden. right? Because you don't want that popping up by default. So what we'll have to do is make some flows to show and hide the Lightbox. And then what we're going to do is on click of this row, we will open this invoice detail page into the Lightbox that's on the home page. Okay, so that's like the most common way we would typically do this. And the nice thing about that is you always have this one context back on your home page where you're sort of like opening everything into. So in the SaaS starter, for instance, if you go look at the app page, there's a left panel and then there's like a content panel on the right. And basically everything just opens into that content panel. Same concept here. I'm just opening it into a Lightbox instead of that content panel. So let's make the home page. We're going to do two flows, one to hide the Lightbox and one to show the Lightbox. So on I usually write these out as Lightbox hide and Lightbox show, like that. And I do that just for organization of naming on the left so that I can see that. So the reason that the Lightbox defaults to hidden is because we have these classes on them for hidden. So if I look at these two elements, there's hidden on both of these. And if we look at the styling in there, what it's actually doing is scaling it to 0, setting its opacity to 0. And so basically it's like kind of like shrinking it. And if you remove that, it's going to pop it back out to the default. So what we're going to do to show it is remove those two hidden classes from those two elements. So I'm going to use a remove class action, where we're going to remove the hidden class, the outer, from the outer. And then I'm going to duplicate this. We're going to remove the inner hidden class from the inner. So now when the Lightbox show runs, it's going to remove those classes, which will then show the Lightbox. On the hide, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to add those classes. So we'll add the Lightbox hidden class, the outer, to the outer. I'll duplicate that again. And we're going to do the inner hidden class, add it to the inner. So now on Lightbox hide, we're going to add those two classes to those two elements, which will hide the Lightbox again. So now that we have these flows set up to hide and show the Lightbox, there's two things I'll do. One is, well, actually, let's do this. Yeah. Let's make it to where on click of this, we're going to do a new event, a new flow on the click event of open invoice detail. And there's two things we need to do here. One is we need an open page action that will open the invoice detail page into the Lightbox. And then we need to run the flow on the home page to show the Lightbox. Because if you don't do the show the Lightbox, you're going to open the page into the Lightbox, but the Lightbox is still hidden. So it won't show you anything. So 2 steps, open page. And in the open page, we select what page we're opening. In this case, we're opening the invoice detail. And the container we're opening that page into is on the home page. And the element is that Lightbox inner. Right, so it's just going to be like the inner portion of the Lightbox, not the whole background part of it. These other two input arguments in here, these like most of the time for this kind of thing, you really don't need to do this because a lot of it's automatic. So if you wanted to run a specific action on that invoice detail page, you would choose invoice detail, specific flow, and you can just like run that flow. And the reason for this is sometimes when you open it from one place, you want to run a certain flow. And when you open it from a different place, you want to run a different flow. And that allows you to control that. But most of the time, it's just going to run page load and you don't need to worry about any of that. Same thing with page data. This is basically saying, what data do I want to push to that? And you can provide it any JSON object you want. And every property inside that object becomes a variable in that page for use. But like I said earlier, it's automatic with builder collection data. So inside of this invoice row, we already know you're inside of a record. So when you open page into container from within there, we're going to automatically push that invoice context into here so that all the page bindings will just work. So for our purposes here, all we need to do is select which page to open and which container to open it into, and that's it. And then the last step is we're going to run a flow on that home page, the Lightbox show. So now when we click on one, it'll open the page into the Lightbox, and then it'll show the Lightbox. So if I come here and I click that, we open that up, and oh, I do have to refresh for that because I think it doesn't have the page on it. Yep. So that's it. Okay, now we didn't set up any way to close this Lightbox. So I'm clicking around, I can't close it, right? So there's nothing I can do to close this. So let's make a close. There's two ways to do that as well. Like everything, there's like a billion ways to do it. One way you could come in here and go to like the outer and let them on click of the outer hide the Lightbox. So they just like click anywhere on the outer and it'll hide it. Another way to do it is on the invoice page, we can add an element to it. So let's add like, I'll just do it as a heading just because it's a little easier. I would probably, usually what I would do is like go get an image, like a nice X image or something like that and do it. But for the sake of time, we'll just do like an X here. And I'm going to style this to position it up in the top right. So we'll go, might do a few other things here. I'm just going to organize this just a little. Let's put all of this inside of a container. It's going to look exactly the same inside of the studio, but we'll need this in a moment. I want this absolute positioned. So the X, we're going to go position absolute, and you could use all props for this, but I like to do it like this. And then I'll do right. Let's go 0. We'll go top 0. So now it's just going to be positioned top right. And then I'll probably add a cursor. Pointer. So now, you know, they'll put their mouse over it. Normally I do like an image and maybe it's got opacity on it. When you hover it, it kind of like shows that it's, you know, it kind of pops a little bit or something like that. But for this, it's just fine. And then on click of that X, we're going to do a new flow to close Lightbox. And this is also going to run a flow on the home page, the one that we already set up for Lightbox hide. Okay, so now if I go back over here and I click my X, it hides the Lightbox. So now I can open these different ones and hide the Lightbox. All right, so now we've got records, we've got them relating to each other. We have the related record data being used inside of those rows. We also have that related record data. Oh, we don't have the related record data being used here. So we need to check that out in a minute. Excuse me. And then we've got it closing the Lightbox. And the next thing I want to do is on here, when you modify the invoice date, we need to make that update the database. And then we can also make that display the date back here and show it automatically update this row behind it in real time without having to refresh or anything, like make it push that data back into the row. So on this invoice date element, we set it to get its data from the invoice date of the invoice that we're on. We also need to tell it on change of this value, AutoSave it. So this AutoSave flow is defaulted on every page. And what it does is it uses the context of your data binding and the record value to automatically know where to save the data to when you modify that element. So when this input is changed, it'll do the AutoSave and it uses all that context. You can also, if you want to save it in a custom way, sometimes maybe you need to manipulate the data before you save it, or you need to do something else. Like for instance, if you're setting up something like a blog post and the user types the title into the post. So they type in, you know, my blog post title. There's actually two things you typically want to save with that. One thing is you want to save the title itself so you can use it later, but you also might want to save what's called a slug for the URL route. So it would be like your title, but with spaces removed and replaced with dashes. So it's like my dash blog dash post instead of my blog post, so that it's properly formatted for a URL. And then you might also want to string add a or concatenate a unique value to the end. So maybe do like a random GUID or something and add that to the end of it. So that way 2 of your users creating blog posts could have the same title, but have different URL links to go to those posts. So in that case, you would actually create a custom flow that's called like save title. And inside of there, you can nest the autosave so that it would save the invoice date in this case, or save the title. And then do this other thing where you're manipulating the data and then saving that to a different field using a update record action inside of here. So you can get much more complex, but for the purposes of just, this is a single field, you're always storing that date value with that with that binding on that same date value. It's just really simple, just change, autosave, and you're done. So now if I come back over here and I open this and I'll click on my little date picker, and we'll just say it's today. I can also, click in here and change this date, whatever I want. So now that is just saved in the database. Oh, which one did I open? Yeah. Here, I opened that one, right? So now we've got that saved in here. So if I change it to, 2025 instead, and come back to it, it's saved that in the database. We can also go look in the database at the invoices, and we can see our records, and we can see there's this one here that's been modified. I can also come in here and just, set a date on one of them, right? And then now when I go back over here, not actually, I didn't really pay attention to which one that was. It was this one, right? So now I can see, so you can manipulate the data in the data collection list. You'll see it live immediately. You can manipulate the data here. You'll go back over there. You can see it live. So you can change that data from within the studio or from out here. So now we want to display that invoice date on here. So maybe what we'll do is just use this invoice to display that date. So let's go over here and let's change this to, instead of not having any binding, we're going to bind this to come from a field, from the invoices, from the invoice date. So now if I go back to my preview, I'm going to refresh. A couple of these will have invoice dates and the other ones won't, right? Because these are the ones that we put them on. So now we're binding that. So now what we want to do is make it to where when we modify this, go automatically update that row in the list. Okay, so if I set that and I go back here and look, it didn't push it because we're not telling it to. The easiest way to do this is also with a data listener like we did on the other one. So you can set up data listeners just about anywhere. So on the invoice row now, I want to go to the page properties, set up a data listener, and we're going to run the page binding on invoices. And you can limit it if you want. Like we could say only on the invoice date changing, right? So don't run it on everything, but if the invoice date changes, go run the binding. Now I do have to refresh for the listeners. If I open this and change this, you can actually, I don't know if you could see it back there. It actually did it underneath the covers there. So now Emmanuel has one, open this one, change it again, change that, we'll just pick a date. And now the second Emmanuel has one. So that data listener is now just doing all that work for us to go find the right row and update the right thing. It's just automatic in there if you use listeners to do that. So remember what I did there was on the invoice row page, I set up a data listener where I'm going to run the page binding again when anything in the invoice collection is changed, but I'm going to limit that to where not anything, I only want it to run that page binding if the invoice date is modified. If you leave this open like that, if you just don't put a limiter on it, then it will run that on any field change for that record. And it's smart, like it'll only run it for that one row, right? So it's not going to, like, if you have hundreds of rows in your list or something, or thousands of them, it'll find that one and only run it on that one row. So you can leave it like this and it should be fine. It'll just update basically everything on that page. So as you add more information onto these rows and things, it will just automatically push that data out. So if we kind of step back real quick, now what we're doing, we've got customers related to invoices. The data gets pushed for the ID of the customer to the invoice record. we're using that information to set the data of the related record, in this case, the customer, onto the invoice rows. And we've got data that we're saving by manipulating inputs on an edit page. And we're opening and closing that edit page into this Lightbox. Search automatically just basically searches everything. And that's it.